Well, good morning. Welcome to Long Hill Chapel. My name is Michael Hoddy. I'm the lead pastor here at Long Hill, and it is just my delight to be with you on this last December Sunday of 2025. This is the week where you're not quite sure what day it is. Is anybody with me? Like, I woke up this morning, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. I have to go to church today. It's Sunday. It's just that day where everything kind of runs together. You're like, is it a weekend? Is it morning? Is it nighttime? Can I eat pie again? It seems like a good time to do that. And so we're kind of all in this in-between period of the end of a year and the beginning of a new year. And I believe the Lord has some things to say to us today, individually, and as a group of people gathered as a church about what that means. Before we get to that, though, I don't usually do this. Is it okay if I do some shout-outs today? Some shout-outs. First of all, my dear friend David Leon is here. He is helping lead worship with Joey this morning. David succeeded me out on Long Island at a church called the Bridge Church, where I had the great fortune of being involved as one of the pastors there for a number of years. And it was a lot of commuting, but it was one of the best, just one of the best seasons of my life. And it was one of those things, and this will become relevant later as we look at where God is speaking to us. It was one of those things I went into where I was totally not interested in being there. I remember the first Sunday I was there, it was this orange room. There's some Italians in this room. It was almost all Italians in that room. I am not Italian, as you can probably tell. Lots of hugging and kissing. So if I violate your personal space, that's where that came from. You can blame it on that. But I just remember saying, God, what am I doing here? And what unfolded in the years after that was really one of the greatest seasons. I hope I was a blessing to them, but they were much more a blessing to me. And David was one of the people I saw kind of God raise up and equip and then release into ministry and service. He succeeded me as the worship leader, and he has just taken what I started to build far beyond. And he's one of my dearest friends, and that's one of the great joys of this. So that's shout-out number one. Shout-out number two, the Hutton family is here in the room. Dan and Miriam and their girls are here. And some of you are like, who are the Huttons? The Huttons, we raised them up as missionaries and sent them to the field. A number of years ago, Long Hill Chapel did this. They were missionary interns here, and they served in the Arab lands. And through just a series of changing seasons and events, and obviously when you look at what's going on in the Middle East, it's a challenging place and challenging situation. Dan and Miriam ended up back here in the States, and Dan is now the lead pastor at Bedford Community Church. Hi, Dan. How are you doing? Good to see you. Up in Westchester County, and they're here with their family today, but they are family to us. And so there's an intersection there. That's shout-out number two. Shout-out number three, I love this one. David and Betsy Schroeder are here this morning. David Schroeder was, how do we begin this story, David? I don't know. He's been the president, if there's a Christian college, he's probably been the president of it at some point. He's currently the president at Pillar College here in New Jersey. He served previously to that as the president of Nyack College, and my path and David and Betsy's path crossed in 1994 when I was a senior in high school in upstate New York at Fulton Alliance Church. And David came up, I think, to speak, but also to poach me. Is that too strong of a term? To recruit me to Nyack as a student, and which is where I ended up. And so our journey goes back 30 years. And we did a lot of amazing things. We traveled overseas together. I worked on his radio show. They ended up at another church I served at, Stonecrest Community Church, and I ended up teaching a little bit at Pillar College. And so the paths just kind of kept crossing and intersecting. But the part where the circle gets closed today is that David and Betsy were on staff here as pastors in the early 1980s when Paul Bubner was the pastor. So like three of you, I've just done a lot of trivia for you in one spot. But here's what I want you all to get. The reason I'm doing shout-outs today is that the story of God is a long story. And the intersections that he makes on the path of that story continue to come back. And sometimes we get to see it, but a lot of times it's hard to see exactly what it is that God is up to. When he leads us in a direction, it's oftentimes not the direction we would have chosen. It's not the way we would have done it. It's not the way the path would have gone. I will tell you, like when I went out to Long Island, that was shout out number one with David, like that was not the path I saw God calling me to. I was going to go be a church planter, and the time was not right, and the circumstances were not right. And praise the Lord, I didn't inflict myself on some poor group of people at that point in my life. And so I ended up, and I remember this, out there in this orange room with all these Italians saying, what am I doing here? This is not where I felt like God was calling me. This is not the thing I thought God was calling me to. And some of you are at a place like that in your life. You're at a place like that where you see how things should be unfolding, or you've prayed that they would unfold, or it makes sense that they would unfold, and it just doesn't seem like it's happening. And the thing I want to remind you today, and I want to encourage you with today, is what God is doing. He's faithful to do it, and I can promise you it won't look the way you thought it was supposed to. I can just promise you that. You have this picture of how you think it should all work out. And you're saying, God, come down and bless my plans. Yeah, I know I'll have to do some hard things. I'll have to take some steps of faith. It might be difficult for a couple moments. But the way that God works is very different than the way that we think he ought to work. And the stories I've just told you all involve many, many pieces of that. And today we're coming to the end of a series called Holding On. And today's title is Holding On to the Mystery. And it is a mystery, but it's really the mystery of the journey that God calls us to and that he leads us on. And as we come to the end of this series, we're going to encounter a story that we think we know a lot more about than we really do. And with that in mind, let's read together from Matthew chapter 2, beginning at verse 1. It'll be on the screen behind me. If you have the LHC app, there's a Bible in that app. If you prefer analog Bibles, they're in the pew rack in front of you. But let's join together and let's read. This is some familiar words of a familiar story, but I believe God has something unique and new for us today. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written." I'll stop right there just to insert a little bit of color into this whole thing. King Herod was a local king who had been kind of set up as a regent or kind of a placeholder king by the Roman Empire over the Jewish people. This is what the Roman Empire did every time they conquered a land. They found a local guy, and they said, "You go be king, and here's the rules. You get to be king, you get to do all the king things, you get to have the throne and wear the crown. You don't cause any trouble, and you pay taxes to Caesar." And you recognize that Caesar, the emperor of Rome, is the ultimate boss. He's the ultimate lord. So the reason King Herod's a little concerned about this is because it sounds like there's a problem brewing. It sounds like there's a threat to his rulership. And what's interesting is he actually has no idea what's going on. So he calls together the chief priests and he says, "Hey, what's this about? There's probably something in the Old Testament scriptures about this." And so they come and they say, "Here's what it actually says. Here's what you can count on being true." So we go on in the passage. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. And then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. The word of the Lord. There are many things in our lives where the title is nothing like the actual reality. Think about this: chicken of the sea. There's no chicken involved. That's tuna for those of you who don't eat that stuff. Reality TV. It says reality, it's TV. It's not reality at all. Here's one maybe some of you have experienced this Christmas: customer service. So there's this picture of what you think it's going to be like, and then there's the reality of what it's actually like. And we come to this story, and this is another one of the Christmas pageant kinds of stories. You know, if you were a really good kid in Sunday school, you got to be one of the kings. I was not a really good kid. I never got to be one of the kings. And there's a song that we sing called "We Three Kings of Orient Are." It's one of the Christmas songs that we sing, especially after Christmas. The problem in this story is these gentlemen who come are not kings. There are not three of them. There are three gifts that they bring, which is where that idea of the three kings comes from. And they're not from the Orient. They're from the eastern lands. They're probably from Iraq, the area we would call Iraq or Iran today. And so there's a lot of things we think are true about the story that actually are not true about the story. And the other thing that's easy for us to do with this story, even more than other parts of the nativity story, is to lose the reality of it. It's easy for us to lose the reality of it. Because we've seen all the Christmas pageants. Like, these guys are part of the nativity scene that is on my buffet in my living room. And periodically, like, one of my kids will come by and I'll steal, like, the staff from one of them. And he'll run off with it, or cats will bat at it, or something like that. And so this is just kind of part of the background. It's part of the aesthetic that we have of Christmas. But the problem we have with this and with that mindset is this is not a legend or a fable. This is written in the scriptures, and it's written especially in the Gospel of Matthew. And Matthew was writing to a particular audience. He was writing to the Jewish people to convince them that Jesus was the Messiah. This is the reason constantly as you read through the Gospel of Matthew, he's referring back to the Old Testament. He does it right here. He refers back to the Old Testament prophecies or the Old Testament scriptures. And so he's doing this for a reason, and that's the thing we have to hold on to in this story, is that he's telling this story for a reason. He's doing it to establish the credibility and the historicity of who Jesus was. And so the wise men, they came from the east, but they were not followers of God. These are not believers. And we love the end of the Christmas pageant where everybody comes to the manger, and there's a giant star that's hoisted up, and if it's really like on point, they'll light it up at the end and they'll sing a big song. These are not believers, at least at the beginning, in Jesus. And so this is for all of us, whether you are here today for the first time, if you happen to just be scrolling by and you're watching online and you're like, church is interesting, I think Christmas is kind of cool. This Jesus story is not something I can get aboard with. There is something for you here today as well. And I believe that God has you here for a reason and a purpose. So they're not kings, they're from the east, they're not followers of God. The Magi, you can kind of see the root word of how they were seen in the ancient world as magicians or astrologers. You can think of them as scientific theologians or theological scientists. Nowhere else in the Bible are astrologers spoken of positively. This is never a good thing, but in this particular moment, there's something good that Matthew is trying to get at. He's coming at this from a unique angle, and he's trying to lead us to a unique conclusion. So what was going on in the world at this time, the Roman Empire was in full sway, as we've talked about, and the most famous ruler of the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar, had died some years before this. And when he did, in the year of his death, there was this great supernova that happened in the sky. So there's this great celestial event. And when you read, some of the secular historians of the time, they tell about it. And this really helped the astrology business a lot. So if you're into studying the stars or looking at the heavens and trying to make sense of things from the heavens, this event that happened around the death of the great emperor Julius Caesar really helped that business a lot. And what happened is people began to believe that any time a great king was born or died, there would be a sign in the heavens about it. And so throughout the region, there was this idea that if there was a great king who was going to be born or one that passed, there was this sign that would happen in the heavens. And there was also at the same time, and this isn't just like the Jewish idea of Jesus or a Messiah who would come, there was this rumor throughout the mainstream world that a great king was going to come out of Judea. So this wasn't the Jewish prophecies of this. This is in some of the pagan historical accounts. If you read Tacitus or some of the other ones like that, you find that there was this rumor that there was a great king who was going to come out of Judea. And so what this does is this begins to set the stage for why the Magi showed up at the place and in the way that they did. And it also is recorded that in this year, in the year of Jesus' birth, there was this intersection of Jupiter and Saturn in the night sky. And so it was this thing that looked brighter than it usually would look. As I mentioned this already, we are looking up in the night sky a little more here in New Jersey than we usually do, and we're seeing some things that are making us go, is that an airplane, really? Or is that something else? And my kids love going outside. One of my sons thinks everything is a drone. It's like, I'm like, no, that's an airplane. He's like, no, that's a star. But there was this interest in what was happening in the heavens. And it happened, this confluence or this intersection of Jupiter and Saturn happened 3 times in the year of Jesus' birth. It happened in May, October, and December. And so these men, these astrologers, these magi would have put this whole story together. They would have started to put some of the pieces together. And they would have said, there's something going on. There's this rumor of a king coming out of Judea. And there's this idea that we have that when a great king is born or passes away, that something happens in the heavens. And so they didn't just say, hey, you know what? Let's go ride camels 800 miles into the desert for no reason whatsoever. They had some pieces of the puzzle that led them to a conclusion. And when they would have shown up in Jerusalem, there would have at least been an idea of why they were there. Now, I've told you a bunch of interesting facts and figures, and some of you have started counting the lights on the ceiling. And it's easy for us to say, what a cool, interesting story, and get out of here and go to lunch. But here's what I want us to get. What is Matthew? What are the scriptures? What is God trying to speak to us here? What's he trying to say to us here? It's simple. You're going to expect someone like me to say what I'm about to say. But then we're going to journey into how it has an impact in our lives. I believe what Matthew is simply trying to say is this. He's trying to say that the wisdom of the world bows down to Jesus. The wisdom of the world bows down to Jesus. There's a lot of great knowledge and understanding in the world, but ultimately it bows down to Jesus. One of the things the church does a terrible job at times is honoring the wisdom and the intelligence and the gifts God has given to us in science and philosophy, in history, and all these other understandings, and giving them value. And we create this artificial binary that says, that's all worthless, but, just check your brain at the door and decide to follow Jesus, and off you go. And it's not that, because God has given us the wisdom. He's given us the gifts of science. He's given us understanding. He's given us brains. He's called us to journey, to expand our understanding as far as we can. But then ultimately, at some point, this bows down to Jesus. Let me make this a little more personal. These wise men were on a journey, and you're on a journey too. Some of you literally, others of us figuratively. We're all trying to find our place in the world. We're trying to figure out how this all makes sense, how the events of our lives lead us somewhere. We're trying to figure out the things that we didn't count on and the things we planned for, how those intersect and how those take us in a direction. Maybe it's even spiritual, where you're trying to say, God, where are you leading me? What are you trying to do in my life? What are you trying to grow in me? What should I do next? Where do I need to wait? Where do I need to step out in faith? How do I know the difference? You're in that kind of a place too. And any number of those things can start you on the journey. I was thinking about my father, who is now passed, but I was thinking about his journey back to faith. He grew up in church. Brilliant man, nuclear scientist, went to the Naval Academy. And he decided that he was going to put this faith thing, this Christian thing, to rest once and for all by researching all of the texts and all of the philosophies and just figuring out how to disprove it. And it literally led him back to on the steps of the Naval Academy Chapel in Annapolis, Maryland, getting down on his knees and praying to receive Jesus as his Savior. That's where that journey led him. And it's where I believe it leads us as well. So any number of things can have started us on this journey. Circumstances, good things, bad things, happenstance, events. Some of you recently, you've become parents. And you've looked up and you've looked around and say, you know what, whatever is in me is not enough to do this well. One of the things we find in the church is a lot of times people come back to church when they change those stages of life because they just realize that whatever has brought them to that point is not enough to get them well to the next point. It could be questions. It could be any number of things, but there will be a limit to how far those things will take you. And these wise men, these Magi, they were the smart ones in their world. They're the ones that everybody else would have looked to for answers. When they were looking to the heavens, they would have asked people like this, what is it that's going on? And I think it's easy for us to look back at people like this, who are trying to make sense of the stars and just kind of chuckle because we look in our own society, we look at our own time, we look how sophisticated we've become. We look how much we have advanced, or we think we've advanced as a world, as a society, as a culture. We look back and we kind of chuckle at that. But I think a good question to ask around this is, where as a people are we going to look back in 50 years at whatever we think is so cutting edge and so smart, and it's going to look silly when you and I look back? What is the wisdom of this world that you and I are building our lives on? That when we look back at it, it's going to seem hopelessly outdated. It's even going to seem laughable. One of the fun things about being a preacher is I have a vast, increasing collection of sermons that I've preached throughout the however long I've been doing this. And sometimes I go back and I read some of the early ones. And you know what's interesting when I read those is the scriptures are always true. There's some profound insights, hopefully, in a few of those places. But so often there's some things I look at and they're laughable. And in another 10 years, I'm probably going to look back and I'm going to say the same thing. And if you're honest about your journey of life and of faith, even of your development as a person, if you're humble enough to be transparent, you will look back and say, there were some things I assumed about the world, there are some things I assumed about people, there are some things I assumed about myself that now that I look back at them, they seem profoundly laughable. But in the moment, they seemed incredibly important. You thought you knew how it was all going to fit together. Look what the Apostle Paul says. He wrote much of the New Testament, and he says this to an early group of Christians in 1 Corinthians. We actually talked about this passage a month ago. He says this in 1 Corinthians 1. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where's the philosopher of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of this world? Now, y'all, I'm not in the South, but I like saying that. We're in the room, we're in Chatham, New Jersey. We subtly, and actually objectively this is true in many cases, we're the smart ones, we're the educated ones. This is a pretty high class of people here, and I don't say that for us to pat ourselves on the back at all, but we see ourselves as those people. We live in a place that sees itself as that place, a place of influence in the world around us. Where might our journey actually have elements of foolishness to it? Where might the journey that we think we're on have elements of foolishness? The thing we talk about here, our faith, our Christian faith, it's an interesting intersection of the world we live in, but also something that is very ancient. We don't read from a new book, we read from a very old book. We don't read news stories, we read texts that have been written thousands of years ago and handed down to us. We come in here, hopefully, week after week, and we wrestle with the scriptures. There is a reason we don't wrestle with rock songs or movies or pop culture here. There's a reason for that. There's stuff to be found in those other places, but it's because there's something ancient here that we need to wrestle with that stands the test of time. And I realize that sometimes when we talk about the scriptures, in the circumstances of our lives and the lens through which we see the world, it seems kind of outdated. It seems incongruous at best. Sometimes it even seems a little silly. But in retrospect, when you look back, what will actually seem silly? One of the things I love about being part of Long Hill Chapel is I'm not one of the smart ones here. There are people who have been in faith much longer than I have. They've been in this church longer than I've been alive. And I learned so much from talking about them. Maybe not new facts and figures, but wisdom. And so there's something about this journey, about this wrestling that we do, the way we do it, that changes us. Now, I want to be clear. Those other sources of wisdom, they are not meaningless. They're incredibly important because they start us on the journey. They point us to God. The wisdom of this world around us, it can lead us part of the way, but it won't lead us all the way. And that's what we see in this story. And you and I, we're sincere individuals. We're sincere people who are trying to figure things out. And for those of you who are wrestling today, I want to affirm the journey that you're on. I want to affirm the wrestling that you're doing. I believe it leads you somewhere. And it's not that you have to check your brain at the door or your questions at the door when it comes to this matter of faith. But it leads you in a direction that can't take you all of the way. Look at what these kings were doing. They were studying they were studying the signs in the sky, and they did enough, and they kind of put the pieces together. You know, this legend about a king coming out of Judea, you know, the fact that there was going to be a sign in the heaven, and then the fact that they sought to like literally pack up and get on their camels and go 800 miles into the desert. That's commitment. I always love when they're dressed in those very fine robes. It's like, have you ever ridden a camel like any distance? Dan Hutton, you've ridden a camel. I'm sure you've ridden a camel. Yes. Miriam has ridden a camel. Okay. How many of you have ridden a camel? A few of you have ridden camels. So shout out to all those of you who have ridden camels. It is a reliable, uncomfortable way of transportation. They'll get you far, but it won't be fun. And so these guys made a commitment. This wasn't just like across town or down to the bagel shop in Madison. This was a long journey, and it actually leads them to the place they thought they ought to go, but where the destination wasn't. They show up in the capital city, they show up to Herod, and they say, hey, we heard there's a king, there's some signs in the heaven, where is he? And Herod's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And so this journey, as well-intentioned as it is, as long as it is, it leads them to the wrong destination, and it requires someone to open up the scriptures and say, no, actually it's over here. And so the teachers of the law, the priests, Herod calls them in, and they open up the Old Testament scriptures to Micah chapter 5. And it says this thing about this little backwater community called Bethlehem. Not where you would have expected the king to be. And so they had their way over there. And so the wisdom of this world, the way that we can kind of make sense of this and make sense of that and connect these two things together, it can get us close, but it doesn't get us to the destination. It takes something else, and it takes something more than that. The thing I think that is so interesting about Herod and his advisors is they knew this, but they didn't do anything with it. They knew about this. They had to have seen, someone had to have said, hey, there's that crazy thing happening up in the sky. They had to have seen it, but they didn't do anything about it. And this is a caution for you and I as we end a year and we begin a new year. Wisdom not acted on is wasted. Wisdom not acted on is wasted. We don't come here to learn more interesting things and go to lunch. If there is wisdom that has been imparted to you from the scriptures, from God speaking, from a wise person in your life, and you're not acting on it, it has absolutely no value. Wisdom not acted on is wasted. And so there's this thing where we begin with the wisdom of this world. It starts us on the journey, but it doesn't get us all the way through the journey, because there's a step that's required at the end. It's a step that's required. That step is called faith. And I think what's happening for some of us is we've done the journey. We've gone the 800 miles. We've done it on a proverbial camel. It's not been an easy journey. And we get to where we think the end would be, and we don't find the thing that we're looking for. And it actually requires us to turn away from the Jerusalem, the thing that seems like the destination, and instead go to the Bethlehem. It requires us to turn away from the thing that seems like where the payoff ought to be. Wouldn't that make sense? They find Jesus. Herod's there. He's like, hey, there's the king. And the music swells and the credits roll, and that's not what happens. Instead, there's another phase to the journey. And some of you this morning, you've gotten to where you think the end of the journey is supposed to be. And instead, there's another leg to the journey. And what's happened is that has profoundly disillusioned you. It's profoundly made you question, God, are you doing this or not? I came 800 miles on a camel. But there's another step that involves taking a step of faith where you can't see how it all works out, where you can't see it in the heavens quite the same way, where it doesn't make as much sense as you continue to go. The thing I think that's interesting about this passage, it says this actually in verse 9. So there's this realization the wise men have that they have to go somewhere else. There's no star overhead in this moment. But as they begin to get on their way, it literally says this. After they'd heard the king, they went on their way, and then the star rose and led them to the place. There's something you can take to the bank here, follower of Jesus. You have to get on the way before the star shows you the destination. You have to begin that journey in faith. You may not see where it takes you, but that's the moment that God gives you enough light to see the next step. And so that's the wisdom of this world, the things you've studied, the things you're looking to the heavens, the legends you've heard, the way it's all supposed to work out. It does not get you on that last leg of the journey. But once you get there, that's when the star rises. That's when you can see. And this requires something that we're not known for as people. This requires humility. This requires humility. What is humility? Humility is saying, I don't know how it all works out. I don't have all the answers. Humility is saying, this may not work out according to my best interests. Humility is the thing that allows us to take a step of faith. I think often for us, we sing the songs and we raise our hands and we say, Spirit, lead me where my trust is without borders, and, I will build my life upon you. The words we just sang, great words. But we're waiting for God to come to where we are and do it where we already are. And he's saying, no, you're at the place you think you ought to be, but there's another leg to the journey that's going to take you somewhere else, and it's going to seem like it's in the wrong direction. It's going to seem like it's going to the wrong place. All of those stories I told you at the beginning, all the shout-outs I gave, are all examples of stories that had a leg in them that didn't make any sense whatsoever. Where unless you look back with hindsight, you don't see how it works. You don't see where it goes. You don't see the payoff. It requires you to walk in the dark for a little bit. And then the star finally begins to rise, but it's only after you have begun walking. And there's something else that's even beyond humility. We really don't like this one. It's the reason so many people don't stay on this journey. They get 9/10 of the way there. They do the 800 miles on the camel part, but they miss the last leg to Bethlehem. Sacrifice. Requires sacrifice. We're all about following God, but we're not about sacrifice. We want the following without the cost. And so this journey in the dark requires two things that none of us really like very much. There are so many people who are looking for God. They're even waiting for God. They're waiting for God to show up, for him to act, for him to move. But they're missing God because of this thing called sacrifice, because sacrifice is your move. Sacrifice is your move. So I think a great question for us is, what are you willing to sacrifice to follow God into the mystery, to follow God on the journey? Maybe a better question is, what are you not willing to sacrifice? It's like, I've decided to follow Jesus, no turning back except for this. And God doesn't ask those things of us to make our lives miserable or to take those things away from us. In fact, very often I think he gives things back to us in a different way than we ever anticipated. But it's to say, do you have the faith to follow me where this path leads, where it's going to take you? And so these kings, they leave Jerusalem, and it seems like they're leaving the place where the payoff ought to be, and they're going somewhere where it definitely doesn't seem like it is, because the scriptures, they don't send them somewhere bigger and brighter. They don't send them higher up the ladder. They send them out away from the king to a backwater. And this is something you need to understand about the wisdom and the way of Jesus. It will lead you away from things that seem like success. It will lead you away from things that everybody around you is saying, that's what success looks like. It will lead you in a direction that seems like the wrong direction. And there's a point where you'll come face to face with Jesus, and at first glance, he may not seem like the answer you were looking for. Because these Magi, they don't find a king on a throne. What do they find? A baby in a manger. A baby in a manger. And in that moment, you and I have a choice in how we respond. We have a choice in what we do. And it's something we're used to seeing people do in the Bible when we read the story. But when you think of all the circumstances we just unfolded, this choice is actually a radical, profound choice. What do? They bow down in worship. These are not followers of God, at least up to this moment. They bow down, and I would imagine bowing down in that worship, in worship in a stable, not in a palace, in Bethlehem, not in Jerusalem, not in the big city, but in the smaller place. They bow down in this house and they worship Jesus. He's now a little boy. Some time has passed. It had to take a lot of faith to do that. There's a theologian named J.C. Ryle. He paints this amazing picture of how incongruous this must all have been. These are his words. He says this: they believed in him when they saw him as a little infant on Mary's knee and worshiped him as a king. This was the crowning point of their faith. They saw no miracles to convince them. They heard no teaching to persuade them. They beheld no signs of divinity and greatness to overawe them. They saw nothing but a newborn infant, helpless and weak and needing a mother's care like any one of us. And yet when they saw that infant, they believed that they saw the divine Savior of the world. They fell down to the ground and they worshiped him. And somehow they perceived in that moment that Jesus, in this form, was the satisfaction, was the destination of all that they had built their lives around to that moment. And they offered him gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I was driving in this morning and I was thinking about the fact that those are all valuable things in the ancient world. Gold would still be very valuable to us. But these are the things that many people gave their whole lives to accumulate. They gave their whole lives to get as much of as they possibly could. And almost symbolically, the wisdom of this world, the things that we often build our lives around, is offered, is bowed down to Jesus. But then there's one last postscript in the story. It says it right at the end. They returned to their country by another route. They did not go back the way that they came. And when you encounter Jesus, friend, whether it's for the first time Whether it's in the current circumstance that you're trying to figure out, you're on that camel and you're somewhere in the desert and you're trying to make sense of your life, when you finally come face to face with Jesus, even if it's not the meeting, the encounter, or in the place or in the way that you expected, it changes your course. It changes your course. It changes your path. And it changes your priorities. And at the end of 2024, as we begin a new year, may we as individuals and may we as a church go on a different path, having encountered Jesus this morning. Would you pray with me? God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for the fact that even the stories that we know by heart, the words we've heard dozens, if not hundreds of times, the shape of how we think it all works together, you always have something new to show us. You always have a new way to lead us. I pray for each person this morning as they're holding on to the mystery of how you're at work in their lives. Maybe it's a literal big intersection of a decision where there's two ways to go and they're not sure which way to go. Maybe it's just coming to the end of another year and asking the question, God, where are you leading me in 2025? What's going to happen next year? What do you have for me? What do you have for my family? What do you have for my relationships? There's so many questions. There's so much complexity. What do you have for my kids? I've tried my best and I just am at my wit's end. I'm facing this new year with a medical diagnosis, with a burden to carry, with an uncertainty that's looming. Or maybe even I'm facing this year with hope, with expectation of all that's going to happen in it. I pray that we would be people who bow down before you with our hopes, our dreams, our fears, our questions, our plans, our understanding. We allow you to meet us and change our path. Spirit of God, would you be speaking in this moment to those for whom this is their life and this is their story. I thank you that you've brought us all together around this old scripture text that many of us know, but you've done it for a reason. Would it change us? Would it transform us? And would we follow the last leg of the journey that leads